We are simulcasting the syndicated radio transmission at prisonplanet.tv today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are now 8 minutes into the second hour today. Dr. Tim Ball is a climatologist, PhD, retired university professor and global warming skeptic. He heads the Natural Resources Stewardship Project and is the former head of Friends of Science, a nonprofit organization of those who are skeptical of human-caused global warming. And Dr. Ball, I would just add for all of the viewers out there, can speak to the fact that 37,000 scientists wrote a letter to the Congress, and they signed a petition saying man-made global warming is an absolute fraud. And to that, Al Gore, being questioned a month ago, said, oh, and I'm sure that they believe we didn't land on the moon either. These are conspiracy theorists. Well, you're not a scientist, Al Gore. You're a con artist that owns the major carbon trading company. You also own a controlling share in Occidental Petroleum. You're an oil man. You're a hypocrite. The big energy companies are behind this as well. This is a way to rape the people, put us into neo-feudalism, and control the resources. This is a vertical integration of society. To say that man-made global warming is real is to say that Al Gore invented the internet. I mean, that arrogant person in the early 90s said he invented the internet, which in no literature anywhere. It's well known that DARPA and also some British scientists, I mean, they're credited in the encyclopedia for inventing the internet in the 60s. My father was at UT in the 60s when they were, he knew some of the research departments that were, talking about the internet before it had that name. Computerized data transfer systems over phone lines in case of nuclear war. I mean, this is like saying Al Gore discovered that the earth is round and not Copernicus. It's like saying Al Gore discovered dynamite and not Nobel. It is just, he is a con artist of the highest order. And the science of we've probably interviewed over 100 climatologists, physicists here on air. The fact is the vast majority say it's a total fraud. Only research scientists who are on government or environmental group, land-grabbing group payroll come out and say it's real. And they've been caught, mainstream news, fixing the buoy data, lying and saying that buoys and weather stations showed record heat in Siberia or record heat in Africa. Turned out we've had record cold. But school kids are now being taught that seasons are unnatural even. So this is and that Al Gore says we need to terraform the planet because now they're not saying global warming anymore because that's been proven to be a fraud. Then it was climate change, but people go, well, wait, climate change is a normal cycle. Now the PR firms have come out in the New York Times and said the White House has ordered everybody to say deteriorating atmosphere. Now they actually brought some truth out. And we're going to go to the professor. Because according to climatologists we've interviewed, the Earth is in a very low carbon dioxide oxygen level, according to the different bog samples they've gotten from hundreds of thousands of years ago, ice core samples, and that plants and animals like higher carbon dioxide and oxygen. But that's biologists we've had on that subject. Dr. Tim Ball, climatologist, joins us. Just an amazing researcher, and we're honored to have him for the next 45 minutes. Thank you for coming on, sir.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And by the way, Alex, they've switched also. They went, and I call it moving the goalposts, as you said, global warming, when they discovered that the temperatures were going down, but the CO2 was still going up. So that they switched then to climate change. Then when we started to explain to the public that, look, the climate change is naturally all the time and much more than they understand. And then they switched again, as you said, the politicians came up with that term. But they're also using terms like climate chaos and climate catastrophe, and of course you've got to keep the scare factor up, the fear factor up, to bamboozle people and push your agenda. So it's really disturbing what's going on.
Well, sir, break down the basics for people of what's really going on. The fact that the majority of scientists that I've seen, the UN's got 2,000 scientists. A bunch of them came out and said we didn't even agree to their theory. They just put our names on this. You guys have 37,000 and growing. And then this this blanket lie of man-made climate change is real, and anybody that questions it is a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, well, of course, once you start to get to the name calling ad hominem, as is said in Latin, then you know that you're losing the argument. But just to put this whole thing in perspective, you have to think about, Alex, why the focus on CO2? It's such a small part of the total atmospheric system and mechanisms. In fact, it's a very small part of the greenhouse gases. It's less than 4%. And it's very interesting, the EPA, with their latest changes where they're going to make CO2 a toxic substance and methane and so on, they don't even mention the most important greenhouse gas, which is water vapor. It's 95% of the greenhouse gases by volume. So you really have to ask your question, why the CO2? And my whole career I've gone through this. And by the way, the numbers, they come out with, the consensus is, and as you mentioned, the 2,500 with the IPCC, and now the 37,000 with the Oregon petition and so on. But consensus is not a scientific fact. And so I'm a bit leery about those numbers. You really need to look at why the focus on CO2 and what's going on here. And the answer, when you dig deep, goes back to a gentleman by the name of Morris Strong. Now, he's currently in China, and I understand he's moved there to escape charges by the U.S. government of his involvement with Kofi Annan and their sons in the food for oil in Iraq situation. But he's set up there to sell carbon credits out of China, and just like Al Gore, profiting from it, and also with George Soros to build very, very cheap small cars to import to the U.S. But Maurice Strong, about 30 years ago, said the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? Now, I'm not going to say that industry hasn't created some small problems, no question, but the vast majority of what they've done has been for the betterment of human beings and so on. And but you need to think about, how would you go about destroying the industrialized nations? Now, if you think about those industrialized nations like the engine in a car, because that's a very good analogy for them, we're a carbon-based society, then you can stop the engine by squeezing the fuel line. But if you do that, immediately people will scream. You saw this recently with the increase in gasoline prices, and everybody's immediately mad. But if you can show that the byproduct of those industrialized nations is destroying the planet, then you can effectively shut down those industrialized nations. That's why CO2, the byproduct of burning the fossil fuels, became the focus. And then Strong, when he was asked by Elaine Dewar in a book called Cloak of Green, she said, well, why didn't you run in politics? And he said, you can't do anything as a politician. I went to the UN where I could get all the money I wanted with no accountability whatsoever. And he set up the United Nations Environment Program. That became the foundation for it. That United Nations Environment Program defined climate change as human-caused climate change. And then he set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was to do the scientific investigation of it. And as you pointed out, they list 2,500 people, but less than 500 of them are actually scientists. And I've served on a lot of commissions and inquiries, and one of the things that I learned, Alex, is that commissions of inquiry are wonderful things for politicians because it allows them to defer the heat. So if an issue comes up and says, we need a commission of inquiry. Okay, we'll have a commission of inquiry. Then the media can go to the politicians and say, well, sorry, we can't comment until we get the report. We don't know. We're looking at it. By the time the report comes in, of course, the issue has become